All right, thank you everybody for joining us today for this conversation on diversity and inclusion in the national security and foreign policy communities. My name is Kevin Donnelly, and I'm a member of New America's development team, and we're so excited to have you be a part of this really important conversation, not only for our country, but also for us here at New America as an organization dedicated to the renewal of the promise of America and the pursuit of our highest ideals. So before we get started, as mentioned in the housekeeping notes, if you have any questions, please feel free at any time to include them in the Q&A. I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our three panelists today, and then we're gonna dive into the meat of the discussion. So first, we have Elena Soros, a policy analyst for our political reform program and a 2019 McCloy Fellow on Global Trends with the American Council on Germany. She's also a producer of the Politics in Question podcast, which explores how our political institutions are failing and how we might fix them. She's done work on German and European politics, US domestic policy, civic engagement, and national security, and has written for the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Vox, the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and other publications. Our next panelist is Alexandra Stark, a senior researcher for New America's political reform program. She's written for Foreign Affairs, The National Interest, The Guardian, Small Wars Journal, and other publications. She was previously a research fellow at the Middle East Initiative of the Harvard Kennedy School's Balfour Center and a Minerva Jennings Randolph Peace Scholar at the US Institute of Peace. And our third panelist today is Camille Stewart, an attorney whose cross-cutting perspective on complex technology, cyber, and national security and foreign policy issues has landed her significant roles at leading government and private sector companies like DHS and Google. She was appointed by President Obama as the Senior Policy Advisor for Cyber Infrastructure and Resilience Policy at DHS, is a Truman National Security Fellow, and a Council on Foreign Relations term member. She's a co-founder of the Diversity and National Security Network, on the board of Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, and leads the Cybersecurity and Emerging Tech Working Group. So Alex, I just wanted to give you a chance to introduce the new Models of Policy project here at New America.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. The new Models of Policy Change Initiative, part of what our work is to explore how the who of policymaking connects to the what. So in other words, what is the connection between personnel and policy outcomes? So to do that, we conduct and publish cutting edge research that helps to build a better understanding of how diversity in the national security and foreign policy communities affects policy outcomes. And we also partner with a cohort of really amazing organizations, including the Diversity and National Security Network, which I'm sure you'll hear more from Camille about, that seek to increase diversity in the policy world. And these organizations are helping the national security community to embrace new ways of thinking. They're helping to lift up diverse voices and bring new perspectives to the table, and to create a pipeline of diverse talent. And just yesterday, for example, we hosted an event with another partner organization called Out in National Security to launch their annual list of rising leaders in the LGBTQI community. So through this work, we're not just supporting these organizations, which is really important, but also helping to ensure, hopefully, that the US is better prepared for the kind of complex and multifaceted national security challenges that we face.
Great, thank you, Alex, for that wonderful introduction and for the important work you guys are engaged in. And as Alex mentioned, Camille, I'd love for you to just introduce the work of the Diversity and National Security Network.
Sure, thank you. So the Diversity and National Security Network was founded to elevate the voices already in the national security space. There are efforts around pipeline and around junior folks getting opportunities and internships and things like that. It is important to focus on the entire life cycle. So Diversity and National Security Network focuses on elevating the voices of mid-career and senior diverse practitioners. And that started with lists We have highlighted the Black American community, the AAPI community, the Latino community, and just yesterday we released a list for the MENA American community. And we're really excited to elevate these groups, but also connect with organizations to further facilitate getting their voices out into the world. New America has been a great partner in putting out the lists, but also we've explored other opportunities to tell the stories of these practitioners and also get their perspectives on the issues out into the world. So please follow us on Twitter at NatSecDiver and our website, Diversity and National Security Network.com to learn more. We're always looking for supporters. Our goal is to not have Diversity and National Security Network necessary, to have all of the organizations in the national security and foreign policy apparatus take on this mission so we can all reform this space together.
Great, thank you, Camille. Absolutely critical work right now. We'll be sure to share some links to your Twitter and your website in the follow-up email to all today's attendees and registrants. So to get us started, I think before we can really delve into what needs to be done next, we kind of need to lay the foundation of what diversity looks like in the security and foreign policy communities. What barriers exist to building a more diverse coalition of voices in these communities, and how things are trending. So I think I'm going to turn that over to you, Alex, to get us started in that discussion.
Make sure I unmute myself. Oh, the joys of Zoom. Yeah, sure. So one of the most exciting things for me about doing this work is that when it comes to diversity in the national security world, all of the good things tend to go together. So in other words, we already know that it's critical to have diverse personnel for representational reasons. And in terms of our democratic values, we believe that the national security policy community should look like and should represent and reflect the communities across the country that it's serving. And that's all really important, but what we're beginning to understand more and more as researchers and as practitioners, although the practitioners I think are probably ahead of the researchers on this one, but is that diversity also leads to better policy outcomes. So to put it simply, when you bring in more diverse perspectives, when you have folks with different backgrounds, different life experiences, different ideas about how the world works, you're going to have a more robust policy conversation and get better, sort of more innovative policy ideas. And I think this is actually an idea that really resonates, particularly in the business world, because actually some of the most robust research and academic research so far on diversity and outcomes comes from that business and that business literature. And there are so many studies now that show that more diverse groups in various ways make better decisions. They're less likely to succumb to groupthink. There are studies that show that companies with diverse leadership are more likely to succeed. And additionally, you hear a lot from government agencies that they're always talking about kind of the race for talent and wanting to recruit the very best, the most talented people for positions. And, logically, you're simply not going to find the most talented people out there if you're not casting the widest net possible and looking at recruiting everyone, especially when you're competing with the private sector. And you can't offer things that the private sector can offer its employees to a certain extent. So that's kind of the part of the case for diversity. In terms of the barriers, well, there are a number of them. Some of them are more similar to what you might see in other sectors and in the private sector. But I think there are also ways that the public sector kind of faces unique challenges in terms of recruitment and retention. One thing that comes to mind for me is kind of the clubbiness of the DC policy community, and basically the way that it works. And I know there are other sectors like this too, but you need a mentor or you need someone higher up on the career ladder to be an advocate for you, to put your resume in front of someone, because so much of how hiring works in practice is that people kind of look around to the folks that they already know, and maybe they ask those people for suggestions. So it's like 1 or 2 degrees of separation. But that can inadvertently create these exclusive circles of people who tend to look the same. Maybe they have, the same backgrounds, or they went to the same sort of public policy master's programs or whatever it is. So that's one of the barriers that comes to mind for me. In terms of how things are trending, New Models actually hosted an event a couple of months ago that's was recorded and is online right now. But it looked at how, unfortunately, we're actually seeing a lot of backsliding in terms of diversity in the national security community. So a recent report from the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, which is a government agency, found that the proportion of State Department personnel who are racial or ethnic minorities has been completely stagnant, essentially, since the early 2000s, so for almost 20 years. And that there's also been virtually no change in the proportion of women in that workforce in the same time period. So I think, sort of along with all of the other national security challenges that we're obviously currently facing, I think the potential for diversity backsliding is a really urgent one, and sometimes overlooked one, because if we don't have the right personnel in place, then we're not going to be able to make and to execute good policy decisions. And I think it really is kind of that simple at the end of the day.
Great, thank you. Camille, I'd love to hear your thoughts because you're engaged in so much work on coalition building and network building, strengthening pipelines. How do members in the Diversity and National Security Network and Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, how are they seeing the barriers in action, and what solutions are you putting forth to sort of meet those challenges head on?
Right. I think a big piece of the network problem that Alex mentioned is also the visibility problem. So much of how you advance in this industry is around the platform and the visibility you have, which comes hand in hand with a strong network. But if you don't have that, the kind of way to grow up in the community and get new voices or new people who know your work is by having a platform. So one of the things that both WCAPs, in different ways, because they focus on the full breadth of career and professional life cycle, and Diversity and National Security Network is by creating opportunities for visibility. Folks claim that there are no cyber experts, no national security experts, no foreign policy experts of a certain demographic. And quite frankly, they're here. And that is actually, I think, a really big piece of the puzzle that's missing. There is a pipeline problem for sure. There's a representation problem for sure. But there are a lot of practitioners doing the work already. And in an effort to even get new people in, especially at junior levels, they have to see people who are doing the work and thriving in this industry already. And without those, only hearing stories of folks that have been browbeaten and discouraged and are no longer willing to play in this space, they too will be discouraged and take their talent elsewhere. So a lot of the work is about creating visibility, creating opportunities to connect, to get their voices out there. So partnerships on writing, pipelines to different media outlets to get their voices out there, training to make sure that they can do it effectively, and these lists. So you can never claim that you're not able to find a Black American, a MENA American, a AAPI American who is working in this space, because we've provided these lists with a variety of folks, and that's just a taste. So a lot of the work is about that platform building and making sure folks are ready to respond to the call. Another thing is opening the aperture around where you find those skill sets. I think we're seeing it a lot more as folks traverse back and forth between the public and private sector in ways that we didn't do traditionally. But the tech sector is actually a really great example. So much of what tech is doing now has implications for national security, and our governance model is shifting because as Congress and the executive branch aren't making calls on certain things or aren't making progress on certain things, tech is making calls that affect the norms of how we engage with technology and how it moves and thrives in our lives. And so understanding that there are whole, election integrity teams within tech companies and teams focused on foreign investment and things that are very traditionally national security, foreign policy issues at these companies. That means that they are also rich for voices and talent that we weren't looking at before. And even beyond some of those very obvious job roles, there are folks of different backgrounds who have these experiences that can be leveraged in this space. So translating what the roles are for people, helping them understand how to navigate, how to get plugged in, since it is such a networked space. How do we make sure, even within our own communities, that we're not leveraging those same network models, but funneling in folks with the interest, desire, aptitude, and even if they have to learn a few things, the content piece is probably a lot easier than the hard skills piece, or the soft skills piece, even for that matter. So a lot of the work is about finding folks, opening the aperture early, letting students understand what a national security or foreign policy career is. Many of the people of color who fall into this fall in it to by happenstance or because they've got an immigrant background. So making sure that folks understand that this is an industry where they are able to work, thrive, and leverage their perspectives.
Great, thank you. Absolutely, and I think you kind of touched on helping people to actually understand what a career in security and foreign policy actually looks like. Elena and Alex, I know you've done some work on really thinking about a new security for the 21st century and how we might be able to redefine security to tackle some of the challenges that we face today that really just weren't major considerations previously. Elena, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on how building a more diverse coalition of voices in the foreign policy and national security communities might actually help us to redefine security to meet new transnational challenges, like, for instance, global pandemics or climate change, or the calls for racial justice that we're seeing across the world.
Sure, yeah. So I think one thing that is a common mistake maybe in the national security space is to think that we're the only ones dealing with these problems. And something like COVID-19 is showing that it's not just something that affects one country individually, but something that, you know, really speaks to the importance of alliances to come together to solve these kinds of problems. I think, you know, we talk in the United States about the dual pandemic, the issue of COVID-19, the way that it's affecting our population and different parts of American society differently. But then there's also, as we've seen this summer, the problem of systemic and institutional racism. And so I think every country has such a different experience and background of racism within their society. But the way that we saw the Black Lives Matter protest go from the United States to Japan to Europe, just across the world, that there's these ideas resonating, these problems are also across the country, across the world as well. So from that perspective, the Political Reform and New Models program also looks at democracy as a key part to national security, that democratic integrity and the stability and the resiliency of our democracy are actually national security issues as well. And so from that perspective, it's something that broadening the idea of what we consider a national security issue will be really important moving forward. We cannot just think about national security the way that we thought about in 1935. And so it's something that in our program, and Heather Hurlburt specifically has argued too, that this idea where we keep what is a national security issue and a foreign policy issue and what's a domestic issue, we tend to separate those things. And what we're seeing as, you know, countries become more connected, as tech changes the nature of our everyday life, and as we have new challenges like the COVID-19 pandemic, those silos of what is domestic and what is a national security issue are really kind of, those lines are blurring, and it's important for us to recognize that and recognize that for our allies as well.
Great, thank you. Alex, I know you've done some writing and some research on this topic as well, and I'd love to hear if you have any additional thoughts that you'd want to add on sort of how we're redefining security and foreign policy, and how we might be able to incorporate diverse perspective, not just domestically, but also internationally into those considerations.
Yeah, so one of the things I've been thinking a lot about in the past few months is the meaning of security. which I think should be, keeping Americans safe and keeping people around the world safe. And I think how both sort of the Black Lives Matter movement and COVID demonstrate that we're clearly falling short at that, and that the traditional national security policy really so often fails to speak to the ways that many people experience insecurity or even experience violence in their everyday lives. So I'm really interested in exploring the idea of human well-being as a kind of a new starting principle or a starting point for national security policy. So for example, I work a lot on the Middle East and the war in Yemen. There are all kinds of like these abstract justifications, right, for the US support for the coalition intervention there. We have to push back against Iran's regional influence, or we have to support these important Gulf security partners. But what comes through so clearly to me about that conflict is that it doesn't actually make anyone better off, right? It hasn't increased the security of Saudi Arabia, which is having Houthi missiles lobbed at it now. It hasn't obviously increased the well-being of people in Yemen, since it's created the largest humanitarian catastrophe in the world. And it doesn't really help Americans either, many of whom are actually really deeply concerned about these humanitarian effects, and who would, in many cases, rather see our federal budget kind of directed towards increasing funding for things like health or education or infrastructure that do affect Americans' everyday lives, rather than towards the Pentagon. And I think you see a really interesting parallel here between this really speaks to what Elena was saying about how there's this kind of artificial distinction almost between foreign policy and domestic policy that I think is really, if it hadn't dissolved already, is dissolving in front of our eyes today. That the movement to defund the Pentagon has a lot of parallels to the defund the police movement in domestic politics, because both of these movements are aimed at thinking about what kind of spending, kind of participatory democracy around what kind of spending would actually make people better off in America and around the world. So I'm really interested in how do we kind of set aside these dated kind of Cold War, post-Cold War security frameworks in favor of policies that actually make people's lives better, and that has to include intersectionality at the center of it, so that we're not just centering communities that are already well off, but for example, the disproportionate effects of COVID on certain demographics and communities really points to how we need to center intersectionality in how we think of well-being also.
Great, thank you. Camille, did you have anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so I think it's a really important call out to talk about how domestic and foreign issues are coming together in a way that's unprecedented, but at its core, even traditional national security and foreign policy, many of the decisions were based on race. And until we acknowledge that and acknowledge how our counterparts and how we ourselves weave race into how we engage with other nations, how we make decisions, how we invest, how we do anything, we won't truly realize the effectiveness of the things that we're trying to do that are good, and we won't truly realize the impact of the things that we are doing that have negative outcomes. And so, yes, as things blend and come together, we should be thinking about it, but we also just need to acknowledge that race is an important part of all of the movements that we've made as a nation, and even as we engage on the world stage. And so until we do that, we're not completely living up to either the good things that we're trying to do or able to acknowledge and reflect on and change the negative things. And that's the systemic piece of it, right? Like, it's so woven into the institutions that we've built that we are unable or unwilling to acknowledge that that is a part of our decision making. And that's a big piece of what needs to break.
Absolutely. And that kind of touches on a recent event that New America hosted, that you, Camille, and the Diversity and National Security Network organized with our CEO, Anne-Marie Slaughter, some other field leaders, including Michelle Flournoy, Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, and Alonzo Fulgham, that really talked about the fields of national security and foreign policy 3 months after the killing of George Floyd, and sort of the kicking off of this mass national protest movement for racial justice that has really been ongoing since, Ferguson, years and years ago at this point. Have things changed measurably? We've seen a lot of organizations come out and make statements, but what's changed and what's next?
So I'm heartened by the fact that we are having more of these conversations and that they are actually focusing on issues of race. Conversations on diversity tend to get lost and only focus on women, and honestly tend to benefit white women mostly. And that's not a problem, because women are also, underrepresented and, fighting other things. But there are other groups that are disproportionately realizing the impacts of systemic racism. So the fact that we are able to name it and discuss it is a huge step forward, and one that I am excited about. The fact that we were able to get so many leaders on a stage to talk about systemic racism on a large platform and pull together the national security community around not only a conversation, but a call to action is positive. But we need to see that continue. I think the statements are great. Organizations that are actually implementing processes and procedures, looking at how their organizations move, how they move in the industry, and trying to figure out how they can break down systemic racism from their vantage point is really good. That should not stop 3 months out. That should not stop this year. That should continue. Truthfully, we want organizations like Diversity and National Security Network not to exist. And there's a lot of work to make that happen. There's also a lot of work to go from an initial statement that says this is important to also just elevating the work that you are doing. That could be a flagship for another organization, another entity, another individual to step up and take on an initiative that's similar. So that's one of the things that I actually really appreciate about the New America program, is a lot of their work is very visible. And that's really important, because it's in and of itself, it is a call to action to other think tanks, to other individuals, and to others playing in the space, that this is something you can do well, and you can make an impact. So I'd like to see more organizations talk about their response to this racial justice moment. And I would like to see there actually be systemic change. Michelle Flournoy and I put out an article that kind of walked through some things that needed to happen when a change of administration happens. And those things are just a start, looking at the security clearance process, making sure that all of the leaders across the executive branch take on diversity, and hiring diverse talent as a priority, recognizing race in the policies that we are implementing and the engagements we have. It's really important. So things have changed. We are in this moment where people are willing to have these very tough, uncomfortable conversations. And I hope people maintain that resilience to keep having these conversations. But I want to see continued action. That's the big piece.
Great, thank you. Elena, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you have anything to add to Camille's perspective on this?
No, I mean, I think Camille's right on. I think when we look at decision-making processes, especially in the national security space, it becomes this very gross evaluation of whose lives matter more. I think we did a study, I think it was just last year, which feels like such a lifetime ago, but we did a report called The Consensual Straitjacket, where we specifically looked at the experience of women in the nuclear policy space. And we were talking about kind of, what does it look like? What's the experience for women to be in such a male-dominated space, but also how does that impact policy? And something that one of the women that we interviewed said that it has just stuck with me, I think about it all the time, is she said, we didn't test nuclear weapons in the suburbs of Montana, right? We made a decision of whose lives valued more, quote unquote, to take and what community should take the consequences of something like nuclear weapons testing. And I think that's a really poignant example that the way that, as Camille was saying, race does shape the decisions that our national security force is making every day. And it's something that really needs to change.
Yeah, thank you. So you've all done a great job of sort of getting to the core of this idea of diversity as a strategic asset for national security. And I know, Camille, you've written specifically about systemic racism as being a threat to our cybersecurity. And I'd love for you to expound on that a little bit more, because as the frontiers of warfare are changing, I think we need to really be aware of how implicit biases, both in technology and also in the application of technology, can really have outsized effects on security outcomes.
Yeah, I think a really timely example is disinformation. We have acknowledged that in 2016, Russia targeted Black Americans and used that to interrupt democracy, to push voter suppression, and to sow distrust and confusion. It was effective. We acknowledge that, and then our plans, our strategies, our counter messaging, our alternate messaging has no focus on these disenfranchised communities. We've also seen that it happened to veteran communities. So understanding how underrepresented groups, minority groups, communities of color are both tools and targets. So targets, in the way that I just mentioned, are leveraging their narratives, manipulating them to build distrust and disengage them from the voting process, but also tools, because these divisive, what have become divisive narratives, further polarize the far left and the far right, and they get to argue about these things. So now you've further disenfranchised a group, you've further alienated and polarized the two sides, and we've got more confusion, more distrust that then furthers the outcome of folks not engaging in our democratic process and not trusting it. So that's one example. But also from a technical perspective, or how folks use technology, right? WhatsApp is a good example. In most communities, it is something you use when you travel. I need to reach my friends, I need to reach my family, I'm in another country, it's great. But in immigrant communities, that is a lifeline to your family back home. And whereas chain letters used to come via your email, they're coming via WhatsApp, right? There are images, there are these long threads that give you COVID-19 advice, how to spot it, how to treat it. And it's all this misinfo and disinfo around treatment, identification of the disease, et cetera. As well as you'll see voting information, polling information, all of these very important data sets in an encrypted platform that you had no idea these immigrant communities were sharing, and that you trust a lot more as the recipient because it came from your aunt, your mom, your cousin. And so until someone, likely from an immigrant background, flagged for WhatsApp this different use in this community, we did not have an accurate understanding of how a technology could be used for harm. And so it's a great illustration of how understanding your user base, understanding how your users adopt a technology, leverage a technology, enable you to provide adequate and accurate security controls. And even in implementing the security controls, adoption of those controls does matter based on your lived experiences, because your trust levels, things like that. To the earlier point about how we make decisions based on race, critical infrastructure and cyber attacks on critical infrastructure is a very big problem right now. We're very concerned about it, and it is a real threat to our national security. How critical infrastructure builds resilience will differ based on the demographics of the community, the funding, how it is situated in the midst of a neighborhood, all of those things. And if we're not willing to acknowledge the race implications of that, the socioeconomic implications of that, we won't have the resilience. And our systems are interconnected in a way that you cannot isolate this urban area from the rural area more than so much. And then at the base level, distrust in systems affects outcomes. So see something, say something. While this is not a cyber thing, this is a national security thing. Department of Homeland Security uses that to get tips from folks. If you see something that's not right, say something. But if you distrust the very entity that you are supposed to say something to, Will you say something? Not likely. And so that is a threat to our national security. We're asking people to be active participants in flagging threats, but because they don't trust the entity, whether because of how immigration is being handled, there's a lot of law enforcement entities within DHS, whatever the things are, that means that that program is not as effective. So there is a direct correlation that goes beyond just workforce and beyond the morality and ethical issues around excluding demographics to our very efficacy as practitioners and as a nation and our ability to innovate even beyond that. So, and even how we show up on the world stage, we are lobbying human rights violations and talking about the democracy on the shores of other nations, but can't talk about how that is happening here and the racial injustices here. So quite frankly, it is a perception issue, it is a policy issue, it is a technical issue, and something that we must address if we're going to be as effective as we'd like to be.
Absolutely. And you really got to a great point about institutional trust and understanding. And I know, Elena, Politics in Question is a podcast dealing sort of specifically how institutions are failing and how we might be able to fix them. And I think it's building institutional trust is one of those methods, but I'd love to hear about how we might be able to apply that in this sort of framework of building diversity in the national security and foreign policy communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that is sort of to echo the things that Alex and Camille have said, which is to just change the way that we think of maybe who is a national security professional. I think, on the podcast, we think about institutions both in the sense of what are the rules that govern Congress and how does that shape then policy, but part of that conversation is also about addressing the more invisible institutions. And I think from that perspective, it's the way that Camille was speaking about how people are hired in the national security space, and those issues of networks and who reached in the job hunt process. That also extends to all areas of just general politics in the United States. And so from that perspective, I think it's a little bit about identifying those things and questioning them and knowing that we might not actually see that it is an institution that we're then upholding unless it becomes a more formal process of saying, okay, well, did you actually create a job process for this? Or are you just hiring someone that you know? Are you actually creating the opportunity for other people to apply to build that more diverse set of people to work in policy? And actually, go through all those steps of thinking through what are the ways that this is an invisible institution that's being upheld.
Absolutely, thank you. So I want to give people in the audience a chance to ask some questions. And I think we have a pretty interesting one, and one that kind of gets to the institutional trust question, the representation question, and to a point that Alex made about the interesting parallels between sort of the defund the police and defund the Pentagon movements. And it's about budgeting. And so we think of budgets as indications of our priorities. And if that's true, how can we calibrate our budgets in security and foreign policy to promote diversity in these communities and also to sort of meet the transnational and also the national challenges that we face today? And I'll open this up to everyone, but we can start with you, Alex.
Yeah, budgets I think are an indication of priorities and values. One I would love to actually hear, maybe, I don't want to put Elena on the spot, but I would love to hear more about, I've been thinking about the idea of participatory budgeting, which is something that the political reform program talks about a lot, and how thinking about participation and educating Americans about where the federal budget goes and how it's allocated and how does that line up with or differ from what you think our priorities should be, is a super interesting and important idea that I think the defund the police movement has really kind of highlighted the fact that the budget often doesn't necessarily reflect most Americans' values, and that that's not immediately apparent unless you sort of think about it or sit down and look at how things are allocated. So yeah, I think the idea of getting Americans more involved in thinking about that is super interesting.
Yeah, so just to answer that, sorry, there's also a thunderstorm just rolled in above me, in case you can hear any of that in the background. But so when we think about democracy on a local level, it's something that, as I kind of alluded to earlier, it has to do with overall democratic resilience, actually. And something that we think about a lot is the fact that local government has much higher levels of trust than the federal government does, for example. And so when you can bring people into that process in a more equitable and actually empowering way, that it can really change the experience of democracy and get more towards that ideal of democracy that America hasn't quite lived up to yet. So from the defund the police example, I think right now we have a really unique moment where people are actually really interested in municipal politics. They're really interested in city budgets and learning what their community looks like in terms of the resources that are available, what are the problems that are unique to their community. And so from a participatory budgeting example, that's just one model that we're looking at in the program, in the sense of if you decide to defund the police, and as many cities are doing, that's kind of really the first step. I mean, the next just as important part is creating an affirmative alternative for where that money goes in the community. And participatory budgeting is a process where a small set of money from the municipal budget, maybe $1 million in a place like New York, gets involved in this process where citizens and residents can come in and brainstorm ideas of what that could look like. They get to vote on where they want to see that money go. And so from the local experience, that's a really interesting moment for something like the defund the police movement to say, well, the problem where we got here is somebody else made this decision for our community to prioritize this one aspect of what our community needs. So let's ask the community what else is important and where they want to see that money go instead. So of course that would be a lot harder to do on the national level for something like the Pentagon budget. But what I think could be really interesting is if this becomes more of a movement where cities are actually turning towards residents more to look at what's important in their communities, how do people want to participate, and actually empowering them to help make those local decisions. I'd love to see that then translate to a more national level where not to say that we need to create like national-wide participatory budgeting, but that we start to ask questions about things like the Pentagon budget, and that representatives in Congress are having that conversation with their constituents as well.
Absolutely, thank you. Camille, as you mentioned, if we can't really have the conversation about institutional and systemic racism here in this country, we can't really expect to have the moral force of those words behind our actions in foreign policy. And I think the way that we allocate our resources is definitely a factor to that. So I know you mentioned you wrote an article with Michelle Flournoy about what steps a new administration might be able to take to kind of address these challenges very concretely. And I'd love to hear about who you think should really have the responsibility to manage that kind of change, and some of the more concrete steps that a new administration might be able to take to really address these issues head on.
So everyone has a responsibility, but it has to start with leadership. If leadership is not bought into diversity as a priority, that won't trickle down to everyone else. They won't allocate resources and funding and all of the things that are necessary to do that. They won't stand behind innovative ways to engage new folks. DHS had a cyber a recruiting event where they allowed folks to interview on the spot and get a contingent offer, because they had to still get clearances and things like that. But what an innovative way to open the doors to a bunch of people who may or may not have been able to submit a resume before, whose resumes might have gotten weeded out by a keyword algorithm that was used to weed through, or by an HR representative who wasn't fully abreast of what the needs were, and have a conversation with the hiring manager and actually get hired on, so that they could express their skills for themselves, and that the hiring manager, knowing what gaps and skill sets they needed on their team, could have a conversation with a potential candidate. And it yielded a lot of diverse hires, some of which I know personally. And those are opportunities driven by leadership, executed by everyone, that are really important to getting new folks into the door. There are gaps in our security clearance process. That is a huge loss of talent. Folks with immigrant backgrounds is the hallmark of the US. And if you have an immigrant background and that prohibits you from being in the pipeline, or delays you by a year because the security clearance process is going to be so cumbersome, I mean, not to mention that the security clearance process needs help in general, but because it's very slow, but it gets worse if you've got these, international ties. And we need to be thinking about, how do we assess on someone's individual merit whether or not they are able to uphold our security in the security clearance process, with or without having international ties. And so that needs to be revamped and turned on its head. That's a big loss of talent, and a big means for folks to self-select out when they start to understand what that is. There are a lot of opportunities to, as I mentioned earlier, engage folks who are in other sectors and display the skills necessary. So recruiting in the next administration talent from the private sector, from civil society, and really understanding what the skill sets are, and mentoring folks, helping people be able to better articulate what their value proposition and understand what the skills are in these roles in government, would go a long way towards getting new folks in. But it has to be a priority for leadership. It has to be incentivized, and it has to be built into systems and processes.
Absolutely. And Alex and Elena, I know in your work in the consensual straitjacket, you did a lot of, you took a deep dive into sort of how things have been successful and how they haven't. Is there anything that you wanted to add specifically from your research on how certain institutions were able to really successfully build people up and incorporate more diverse voices into their work in this field?
Yeah, so Camille mentioned one of the sort of unique challenges that the national security community faces, which is the whole clearance process. And another one that comes to mind for me is that a lot of folks, once they do get that clearance, will need to be working with classified information. And that often means being in the office to be able to access that information properly. They might also need to be responsive to crises kind of as they erupt around the world at any time. So they have to kind of be available at all hours and willing to sort of rush into the office. And there's this kind of being physically in the office model to doing this. When we were doing the research for that report on women in nuclear security, Michelle Flournoy actually told us about a human capital initiative that she created at the Pentagon when she was there, which sort of gave everyone access to a certain amount of flexible time. And she saw that was useful not just for folks who were carers or have like particular caretaking responsibilities, whether that's, elderly parents or guardians or kids or whatever. But it was also a way for even folks who didn't have those responsibilities necessarily to kind of have more of a work-life balance. So I think she talked about someone who used that flex time to train for a marathon, for example. And she found that having those flexible policies led to really substantial improvement in the quality of the work, so much so that her boss was like, wow, the quality of the work here has really increased. Like, what did you do? Did you hire a whole new set of people? And she was like, no, I just implemented this human capital initiative. And that's sort of an example of how, I mean, the good news about sort of hiring and retaining folks is that we already know a lot of the things and best practices that organizations can do to do that. So these kinds of flexible time initiatives, for example, can be taken from other sectors and applied in specific ways to the national security sector that takes into account the unique challenges of having to be in the office or access classified materials or whatever it is. And on the report, we were really lucky to partner with New America's Better Life Lab, which has done a ton of research on things like optimizing family leave policies, making the promotion process more accessible and more transparent, creating strong anti-sexual harassment policies and trainings that actually work, and all of those kinds of things that are critical, not just to recruiting, retaining diverse voices, which is obviously critical, but really for the well-being of everyone who works at an organization. And that can also, again, lead to better outcomes, not just happier employees.
Awesome, absolutely. Well, I think that is a great place to end it. I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists for participating today. This is such an important conversation to have, and we are so lucky to have been able to include you, Camille, because you're really leading the way on a lot of these efforts. And again, Elena and Alex, thank you so much for your research and your participation today. To all of the attendees, we'll make sure to send out links to the Diversity and National Security Network website, Women of Color in Peace and Security, and some more information from the Political Reform Program. All right, everyone. Well, thanks and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.